spoken in a calm, reflective tone, with slow, cinematic visuals of someone sitting alone in a dimly lit room, city lights flickering outside the window. It's not the silence that scares you. It's what the silence reveals. You say you fear being alone, but that's not true. What you really fear is meeting the version of yourself you've been running from. No distractions, no noise, just you and everything you've buried. So ask yourself, when the world goes quiet, who do you become? Beat. A pause as the music shifts subtly, drawing viewers deeper. This isn't about loneliness, it's about the truth. And in the next few minutes, you're going to see why solitude isn't your enemy, it's your mirror. There is a particular silence that falls when the noise of the world fades. Not the gentle quiet of a peaceful evening, not the soothing hush of distant winds brushing through trees, but a far deeper, more unsettling kind of silence. It is the silence that begins to stretch itself out once all distractions have been stripped away. Once the phone has gone dark, the room has emptied, the notifications have stopped, and there is nowhere left to run. That silence is not just the absence of others. It is the presence of you, of what you've ignored, of what you've buried, and that, more than loneliness itself, is what terrifies you. Because in truth, you don't fear loneliness. You fear meeting yourself in the mirror of silence. You fear what you might find when the crowd no longer tells you who you are. You fear who you are without the echoes of validation. You fear the voice that emerges when no one else is speaking. Loneliness, as it is commonly understood, is merely a container, a space where the self becomes amplified. But what most people interpret as a longing for companionship is, in reality, a desperate attempt to escape from themselves. The ache they feel isn't always for others. It's for distraction, for escape, for a way to look anywhere but inward. It's a hollow craving not for connection, but for noise, any noise that will drown out the whisper they've been avoiding their entire lives. There's something profoundly revealing about the moments when you are finally alone, not just physically, but spiritually. When no one is watching, when there are no expectations to fulfill, no performance to maintain, when the armor drops and the stage goes dark, what remains then? Who are you when you are not being anyone? And that question, that terrifying, beautiful question, is the one most of us spend our entire lives trying to avoid. From the moment we're old enough to speak, we're taught to build identities, constructs shaped by parental expectations, social roles, cultural scripts, and unconscious survival strategies. Be the smart one, be the funny one, be the responsible one, be the rebel. Be what they need you to be so you can belong, so you can be safe. We become actors in our own lives, rehearsing roles we didn't write, chasing approval we never questioned, perfecting masks that slowly began to feel like skin. But these roles, these masks, they cannot survive solitude. In solitude, they begin to crack. And beneath the cracks, something ancient stirs. Something raw, something real, something that doesn't care about likes or followers or applause, something that remembers who you were before the world told you who to be. That is why loneliness feels so terrifying, because it is not just the absence of others, it is the return of you, the unfiltered you, the vulnerable you, the ashamed, confused, grieving, uncertain you, the you that you've spent years hiding, even from yourself. And facing that self, really facing it, means confronting the truths you've avoided for too long. The wounds that never healed, the dreams you abandoned, the lies you told yourself to survive, the pain you inherited, the parts of you you disowned just to fit in. All of it waits for you in that silence. It is no wonder so many people would rather stay in toxic relationships, scroll endlessly through curated feeds, numb themselves with substances or busyness or noise. Because these distractions, though exhausting, are easier than honesty. They're easier than sitting alone in a room with your own mind. They're easier than the radical act of self-confrontation. But what if we stopped running? What if we made loneliness our teacher instead of our enemy? What if we entered solitude not as prisoners, but as pilgrims, willing to go inward, willing to listen? What if the silence you fear is actually your salvation? Because here is the truth, the terrifying and beautiful truth. The only way out is in and until you are willing to sit in the presence of your full self, with all its brokenness, its glory, its contradictions, and its wounds, you will never feel truly connected to anyone else. Because intimacy with others begins with intimacy with yourself. You cannot offer to others what you have not yet learned to give to you. So many relationships fall apart not because of incompatibility, but because they are built on shaky foundations, on two people who are strangers to themselves, hoping the other will fix what they've never faced. And when that illusion fails, as it inevitably does, the blame is placed outward. But the real journey, the real reckoning, must begin within. To sit with your loneliness is to sit with your truth. It is to hear the voice underneath the noise, the voice that knows what you really need, the voice that has waited patiently through all the years of pretending and performing for you to finally listen. That voice is not cruel. It is not shameful. It is not judgmental. It is simply honest, and it may tell you things you don't want to hear, about how much you've been avoiding your pain, about how much of your life has been lived for others, about how deeply you long to be seen, not for who you pretend to be, but for who you really are. It may tell you about the parts of you you've lost in the process of becoming acceptable, but once you hear that voice, you can never unhear it. And though it may be painful at first, it is also the beginning of liberation, because from that place of radical self-honesty, you begin to rebuild, not from performance, but from presence, not from fear, but from truth. Not from who you think you should be, but from who you really are. And that is where real life begins. That is where real relationships begin. That is where real love begins. But first, you must walk through the fire of your own aloneness. You must resist the urge to reach for the phone, to scroll, to call, to escape. You must learn to sit still, not as punishment, but as pilgrimage. You must learn to breathe through the discomfort of not knowing who you are, because that discomfort is sacred. It means the old identity is breaking, and the real self is emerging. Carl Jung once said, "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakens." And that awakening, while often messy and filled with sorrow, is the only path to wholeness. Loneliness, when faced with courage, is not a curse. It is a sacred mirror. It reflects not just your fears, but your forgotten beauty, your buried creativity, your silenced truths, your innate power. And once you begin to reclaim these pieces of yourself, you become dangerous in the most beautiful way. You become someone who no longer needs others to fill a void, because you've made peace with your own company. You become someone who can enter relationships not out of desperation, but out of genuine connection. You become someone who is no longer enslaved by the fear of being alone, because you've seen what waits for you in the silence. And it is not a monster. It is you, the real you, the one you've been searching for all along. And as you begin to dwell longer in those quiet hours, those moments where your breath becomes the only rhythm you hear, and the walls of your room become less of a prison and more of a sanctuary, you start to notice that the terror of solitude begins to soften, not because the fear is gone entirely, but because the act of facing it repeatedly has revealed that beneath the panic lies a kind of peace that can only emerge when you've stopped trying to outrun yourself. This peace is not the naive kind that comes from ignoring life's pain or pretending that things are easier than they are. It's the kind of peace that arrives like a slow, knowing exhale after years of holding your breath, after years of constructing identities, accumulating achievements, entertaining roles, and chasing distractions in a desperate attempt to avoid that which was always waiting quietly within. You come to see that the ache of loneliness was never about missing others. It was about the distance between who you are and who you were pretending to be, a gap that widened each time you abandoned your inner truth in favor of being liked, accepted, admired, or understood by a world that never truly saw the fullness of your being to begin with. And as this realization dawns, slowly, then suddenly, you start to feel a grief unlike any other, not because something is being taken from you, but because you are finally witnessing all the moments you abandoned yourself, all the versions of you that never got a chance to be born because they were too wild, too sensitive, too honest, too strange for the boxes you were forced into. But even in that grief, there is beauty. Because to grieve the parts of yourself you lost is also to honor them, to say, I see you now and I'm sorry I left you behind. And in doing so, you begin the sacred process of reassembling your soul piece by piece, not into something perfect, but into something whole. And maybe for the first time, you realize that being alone is not the same as being abandoned, that solitude is not a sentence, but a sanctuary, and that facing yourself, truly, tenderly, and without judgment, is the most courageous act of love you will ever undertake. Because now, when you sit in silence, it no longer feels like a void demanding to be filled, but a space inviting to be listened to, a space where you no longer have to perform, where the masks melt off, and where the questions that once haunted you now offer themselves as invitations to become something deeper, something truer, something more fully alive. And with this inner shift, the world around you begins to change, not because it has actually changed, but because your perception is no longer filtered through the desperate need to escape the present moment. You begin to taste life differently, to feel time stretch out in meaningful ways, to notice the quiet magic in ordinary things. A breeze through a window, a cup of tea held slowly, the sound of your own breath echoing through the hollows of your ribcage like a forgotten hymn returning home. This is not a quick process, nor is it easy. It will demand everything from you, especially the things you most tightly cling to, your image, your certainty, your illusions of control. But in exchange, it will give you something no one else ever could, a relationship with your own soul that cannot be taken, cannot be shaken, and cannot be substituted by anyone else's love or presence. And when at last you re-enter the world, when you walk back into relationships, into conversations, into the chaos of life, you do so from a place of groundedness, no longer needing to be completed or rescued or validated, because you have met yourself in the silence and discovered that you are not broken, not empty, not unlovable, but simply layered, complex, and deeply worthy of belonging to yourself before anyone else. And perhaps this is what true freedom looks like, not the absence of responsibility or difficulty, but the inner liberation that comes from knowing you are enough as you are, that you have walked through the valley of loneliness and emerged not diminished, but expanded, not hardened, but softened, not lost, but profoundly found. So the next time loneliness wraps itself around you like a cold fog, remember this: it is not your enemy, but your initiation, not a punishment, but a portal, a sacred threshold that invites you, if only you are brave enough to step through, to discover the one person you've been avoiding your entire life, and the only one you will truly ever have, yourself. And so, as the dust settles in your heart, and the voices that once shouted in your mind begin to whisper, faint, almost reverent, you realize that the very aloneness you once feared has become a kind of doorway, a passage not into exile, but into self-reunion. as though your soul had been patiently waiting behind the noise all along, waiting for the silence to grow loud enough for you to finally hear her. You don't run anymore, not because you've become immune to fear, but because you've grown tired of abandoning yourself every time discomfort rises, tired of trading authenticity for acceptance, tired of sacrificing depth for safety, tired of pretending to be less so that others wouldn't feel threatened by your fullness, your sorrow, your joy, your mystery. Instead, you learn to sit with what arises, whether it be sorrow that feels ancient, like a river that has carved itself into the canyon of your chest, or joy that bubbles up unexpectedly, like sunlight filtering through cracked shutters in a forgotten room of your heart. And you no longer label these experiences as good or bad, but simply as real, as sacred, as yours. Because when you stop fearing yourself, you stop needing to prove yourself. And suddenly life becomes less about performance and more about presence, not about being impressive, but about being real, being true, being rooted in something that no longer shifts with the moods of others or the opinions of the world. You begin to notice how people are drawn to this kind of quiet authenticity, not because you are louder or more charismatic, but because you are whole, because you carry the unmistakable energy of someone who has faced their shadows and made peace with their paradoxes, who has walked through inner winters and learned to sit beside the cold without numbing, without fleeing. And when others speak to you, they sense something deeper, something still, like the calm beneath the storm, or the eye of a hurricane where silence holds the world together. And it's not that you have all the answers, but that you are no longer afraid of the questions, no longer afraid of being misunderstood, no longer afraid of being seen without your armor. And as the world continues to spin its illusions, offering countless ways to escape, through screens, through substances, through constant motion, you choose instead to slow down, to feel, to stay awake, because you know now that peace was never found in the absence of pain, but in the courage to turn toward it, to sit with it, to listen to what it came to teach. And perhaps that is the great secret, that loneliness, when embraced rather than resisted, becomes not a void, but a vessel, a place of gestation where the fragments of your soul begin to reassemble into something coherent, something sovereign, something so quietly powerful that you no longer chase validation or visibility, because you carry your own witness within. And maybe this is what it means to grow, not to become someone else, but to finally return to who you've always been, beneath the layers, beneath the wounds, beneath the roles you were taught to play. To return to the child who once knew how to wonder, how to feel deeply, how to trust their inner knowing before the world convinced them otherwise. And from this place, this steady, unshakable center, you begin to move through life with a new kind of strength, not the brittle kind born of ego or control, but the supple strength that comes from surrender, from intimacy with the self, from walking hand in hand with your own heart through every season of becoming. So when the silence returns, and it will again and again, you do not panic, but welcome it like an old friend, because now you understand that the darkness is not the end, but the beginning, that the quiet is not your punishment, but your teacher, that the loneliness you once feared was never loneliness at all, but an invitation back to the sacred intimacy of your own presence. And in that space, raw, unscripted, and utterly alive, you find that you are not alone after all, because you have found yourself, and that changes everything.